Okay, so once again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jesse. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Did we enjoy the film? Yes. Applause, please, once again. Jesse Lerner in the house. So it's such an honor for us that you're here with us and we can see this film with you. You declare at the beginning it's a fake documentary, so like you stated, and so you're already like puzzling the audience at the beginning. You're like, and because it's an impulse, then to like identify, is this real or is this fake? So you activate the viewer from the very beginning, and then it's like an essay. The first part is like an essay on historical appropriations, an overview, I guess. You do the historical overview, and then eventually you arrive at this story of the forger. And eventually we learned was an essay about filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, and you make that statement
At the end.
at the end
Yeah.
about the simulacra, about what is real, staging the real, and the questions about the profession. And so I would like to ask you, or could you elaborate on the goals that you were trying to make with this movie and the intentions?
Well, I suppose by saying it's a fake documentary at the beginning, there are two ways to read that. In that, it's a documentary about fakes and other things, but, the main character that appears in the last 15, 20 minutes is a forger. So one of the things that the documentary is about is fakes. There are these other practices that appear in the film that are not necessarily forging, but when you see morally saying, we're reconstructing the ruins and here we can't see the mural very clearly, so we found it necessary to paint, a feathered serpent over here and then some flowers over there. That's reconstruction. They didn't think of that as fakery, but you could ask, is there some sort of relationship between the reconstruction or elements of the reconstruction and the forging? And certainly, over time, if the styles of reconstruction have changed, you can visit an archaeological site or a building at an archaeological site that was reconstructed in the 1970s, and it'll look different from the way things were reconstructed in the 1910s or the 1900s. So those, there's no like right way to do it. There are just a variety of interpretations. And I guess in terms of like the history, I was interested in other things besides just the forging, right? I was sort of interested in this larger history of collections and exhibitions of pre-Columbian objects and the kinds of political, nationalistic, and ideological projects that they've been used for, and whether they're understood simply as artifacts, for the social scientists, for the archaeologists to study, or the moment somewhere at the first half of the 20th century where they kind of moved from the Natural History Museum being scientific artifacts to the art museum and having objects of aesthetic value. In the way in which I frame that is between these two wars, right? The Mexican Revolution and the kind of nationalist cultural renaissance that emerges after the Mexican Revolution. And the United States is a little slower to pick up on that, but in the context of the good neighbor policy, there's a story that's not in the film that relates to Nelson Rockefeller, where he'd been working in diplomacy during the war and kind of big figure in this Pan-American effort during the Second World War, and was collecting pre-Columbian objects all that time. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, he approached the Metropolitan Museum and said, I have this collection, not just of ancient Mexican art, but also of African art and art from Oceania. I want to donate to the Metropolitan Museum. And the Metropolitan Museum said, no, that's not really art. That's anthropology. Across the park, on Central Park West, there's the American Museum of Natural History, and they collect that kind of stuff, but we don't. And he said, well, obviously you guys don't get it. And he opened up his own museum next to his mother's museum, the Museum of Modern Art, there was in the 50s and 60s something, and into I think the early 70s, something called the Museum of Primitive Art, which is where Rockefeller showed his collection of non-Western art. And then he published the book that you see Lara leafing through, the masterpieces of primitive art, it's called. And then he convinced the Metropolitan Museum in the early 70s, can we do like a special show of masterpieces from the Nelson Rockefeller collection? And the Met said yes, they showed it. And at that point, the politics of the moment had changed, and they said, actually this, at the Met, they said, this is actually art. This isn't an archaeological artifact or something for the anthropologist. It has aesthetic value. So he paid for the construction of this, what's now called the Michael Rockefeller wing of the museum, and they took his donation. So it took the United States a while to kind of understand these objects as having aesthetic value. In Mexico, they'd been deployed that way by the state, which is the kind of official owner of all the cultural patrimony and all the archaeological past since the Revolution. And then certainly going back into the 19th century and the 18th century, or even before that, like in the 16th century, there's an account by Durero, Albert Durer, who says, you should see these wonderful things that are coming from this new place across the Atlantic that just got conquered. They're wonderful. I haven't seen anything so gorgeous. So some Europeans saw them as having aesthetic value, and obviously in the original context, it wasn't about beauty or art. It was about, ritual use and religious significance and so on and so forth. That's kind of a long answer for what you were getting at, but
you still have not finished this answer. This is because there's so much in this film. You pack so much. You pack like it's about the appropriations, cultural appropriation. You bring it that political, social history of both nations. You bring the good neighbor policy and the revolution. And how long did you work on this film in terms of like, we know it's 16th millimeter. Can you give us a little bit of a backstory of how you worked on that?
I think the first thing I shot was with Lara. So I went to Veracruz twice. I went and introduced myself. I didn't know I was going to be able to find him because I just had his name. I didn't have his phone number or his address. But I went to the Jalapa has like this beautiful sort of regional anthropology museum, and I had heard that he had been working there. So I went to the museum and I said, do you know where I can find this forger guy, Brigado Lara? And they were like, oh yeah, he's downstairs in the warehouse, sorting through things. And 5 minutes later, I was sitting down having coffee with him, and I proposed the idea for the film, and he was like, sure, And I think there's something that the narrator says in that section of the film that probably resonates with him, where his success as a forger was contingent on him being anonymous, right? You can't get famous being a forger and still forge. Once you get busted, right, and he went to jail, then he finally gets the recognition that he felt like he deserved. But of course, his objects are demoted, right? The Metropolitan takes his piece off display when they learn that he makes it, because it's not a 10th century artifact, it's a 20th century forgery, and it's sort of a source of embarrassment. So I think, for him it was important to get that kind of confirmation or validation of being in a film, along with, Thompson and Morley and the major figures in this history. And then, sort of looking at the footage and his story, I started to, maybe identify a little bit with him in that, I was constructing a story, and maybe it was, I won't say it was a false story. What I present is honestly a version of, an accurate version of the story that Lara told me. Is that all true? He tells a version of his story where he kind of comes out smelling like a rose, right? That he never fooled anybody. Everybody that bought the pieces from him knew that he had made them. They knew that they were recent and then they fooled somebody else. They flew to New York or Paris, and they fooled the, Sotheby's or Christie's or the collector. So the onus is on them if their deception. because he was above board. And I don't know if that's true or not. It may well be. But, the whole idea of kind of, constructing this, through artifice, creating a kind of coherent narrative of these fragments, I started to identify with Lara. And, there were also fragments that I couldn't find. I wanted to do it all with archival, or most of it with archival footage, except for the Lara sequence and the rebuttal of the Maya grandmother, who's not a Maya grandmother, but the woman who speaks back to Morley and Thompson and says that her father used to work for Morley. She's an actress. She's reading my script. So with this kind of fakery, there were moments where I couldn't find like the right piece of archival narration or the right piece of archival footage. So then I did what they call hand processing. Instead of sending your film to the lab, you go to the dark room, you mix up your developer, your stop, and your fixer. You pull the film off the reel, you slosh it around in the chemistry, and hang it up to dry, wash it and hang it up to dry, and it doesn't look like the lab processed it. It's, the lab has these runners that make sure the chemistry flows very evenly over every frame and that the film doesn't get scratched. If you do it in buckets, it's got like this kind of scratchier look, and it sort of looks like archival footage that hasn't been very well preserved. So I started faking some of the archival footage because I couldn't find the material that I wanted, and faking some of the narration, putting filters in the, Pro Tools to make it sound like it was an old optical track from the 1940s or what have you. And at that point, I was kind of doing the cinematic equivalent of what Lara was doing, and that's how I kind of reached my conclusion at the end.
So some of those, like for example, the Aztecs dancers there, these are the actors that you asked to, or is this like 1940s footage?
Most of that is 1940s footage.
Yeah. It is?
Yeah. There's one shot that was left over from a previous film of mine. But so I cannibalized myself once, but mostly it was cannibalizing, some Encyclopedia Britannica educational film about pre-Columbian societies from 1961.
Because when you state it's a fake documentary, even like provoked me to think, is Morley an actor, or is that real or not?
That's Rui Morley. That's Rui his voice. A lot of sort of specialists in Mesoamerican archaeology are surprised because they've read Morley for years, and then they hear him talking like that, and they're like, is that really his voice? I mean, he does have kind of a funny voice, but yeah, that's really him, and it's really his voice. And in 1932, Fox Movie Tone News did newsreels with this system that they had patented that recorded sound on film, and they sent somebody down there to, he was very interested in publicizing his explorations, his archaeological projects. He wrote magazines not just for scholarly journals, but also for like National Geographic. Like he published a dozen different articles in National Geographic, and he'd go give like popular speeches. So something like a newsreel crew was appealing to him because it was going to, get the information about his project or the Carnegie Project out to a larger audience. Fox never edited it or released the footage, but was sitting there in the University of South Carolina in their archive. They've got the entire Fox Movie Tone collection.
For us as scholars, it's also like the big questions arise in the first film, like in the first part, because where you ask those questions about the value of scholarship, how we can be misguided for centuries, can make assumptions, completely misguided conjectures out of the blue. So this was a great problematization of the discipline of science as such, and the legacies that we have to face and confront and try to make better, do better.
Yeah, I mean, two things. One is, to be fair, in the 18th century and most of the 19th century, there wasn't really a discipline of archaeology, right? So you couldn't go get your PhD in archaeology. There were these antiquarians like, Kingsborough, who thinks that they're the 10 lost tribes of Israel that settled in Mexico. Yeah. And he was, he was working with evidence, right? He compiled like this 12 oversized volumes of reproductions of carvings and codices. He gathered a lot of information, and then he, came up with this pretty wacky interpretation about how, the Jews blow the shofar and the concheros blow the conch shell, so there must be a connection. But he was at least basing it, and even, Le Plongeon was excavating and looking at things and then saying, oh, here's proof that the connection to Atlantis, and his theories are pretty out there too. He believed that the Maya had gone to teach the Egyptians how to build pyramids, and then taught Jesus Christ about, religion. I mean, the dates are all wrong, but, because the Aztec and the Maya pyramids are quite younger than the Egyptian pyramids, but, they didn't know that. And then, by way of Atlantis, they kind of got carried away with their speculations. But, there wasn't really a discipline. So, but in terms of, the cautionary tale for scientists and researchers and scholars today, within, the last half century or so, I'd say until World War II, the Maya were presented as these kind of peaceful intellectuals. The Aztecs were bloodthirsty, they practiced human sacrifice, but the Maya were really interested in astronomy and predicting the next eclipse and making these, calculations of, different planetary observations. And they were not warlike. They were interested in sort of the realm of ideas and the mind. And then during World War II, and it wasn't quite really sort of documented well until the second part of the 1940s, these murals in Bonampak show that, the king at Bonampak sent his army out to kill the soldiers of the other guy's kingdom and bring back prisoners. And, there was actually as much warfare there as there was anywhere else. And there had to be and I think now, and then since then, there's been kind of an overcompensation where the Maya went from being, intellectual, astronomer, peaceful thinkers to being nowadays, the dominant textbooks on the Maya are called things like the Blood of Kings, and they were all about, pulling cords through your perforated tongue and bloodletting, and, they're like super gore. And it's easy for me to imagine in the same way that, the peaceful intellectuals went into bloodletting, gore, warriors, that a generation later somebody else will come along with some other paradigm and that'll get revised as well. It's a bit of an overcorrection. So, I'm not sure that we're ever going to reach the definitive interpretation.
And they have also been able to decipher more of the Maya alphabet in most recent decades,
right?
Since Thompson.
And Thompson's effort to decipher has been thrown out in the trash. This whole business about, shock means shark, and shark lives in the water, which means jade, which means counting, all that has been
out the window. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But he was such a dominant figure that, while he was alive, the whole effort at decipherment was kind of frozen on that side of the Iron Curtain, because if you proposed anything different, you were going against Thompson's interpretation, and you would have no
because
career.
actually the Soviets.
Yeah, the Soviets went further because they were outside of Thompson's sphere of.
One final question, and let's open this to the floor to people here. But I couldn't help being in the lecture yesterday, being a fake documentaries lecture. There was I couldn't help noticing you're referencing. The Hollywood filmmaker going to the revolution, filming Pancho Villa, which you mentioned, or the Orson Welles' voice at the end.
Yeah.
And also, the animations which you used, which reminded me of no other than Terry Gilliam and Monty Python, right?
Yeah.
So, can you talk about the form and your dialogic nature of this documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was important for the kind of central part of the film to be archival footage, right? So sometimes I'm using archival images and the archival sound that comes with them, but I also play with it a lot, and I take archival images and take archival audio from something else that didn't really go with it, and sometimes I record my own audio and run it through the filters so it sounds like archival audio and put it with the archival images, or take the archival audio and shoot my own stuff, hand process it, and make it look like archival images that went with the archival audio. But this whole idea of, sort of using fragments, using artifacts, in the same way that in the museum, the fragments from different archaeological sites have been reassembled to create a new narrative. I wanted to create a new narrative from cinematic fragments.
Beautiful. Questions, please?
I had a lot of thoughts watching the film.
Yes. First of all, I was wondering, like, if I was thinking about like the Wes Anderson version of this film because of the Morley guy. It seemed like almost like the Bill Murray character from the Royal Tenenbaums. In this. And I also thought, like you were saying, Grzegorz, we academics are such assholes. And you can just see behind these guys this whole academic structure behind them, like you were saying. Like nobody's going to challenge this idea because this guy is the one that sort of runs this field, right? And if you don't follow in the footsteps of this guy, then and he's the one interpreting it for everybody anyway. But one of the things I was thinking about and watching it was, and this whole idea of like what's real and what's fake, and is there really a real? It's always an act of interpretation and imagination, and the original was an act of imagination, right? So I was thinking about like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and and Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, and the more recent version, which also has this reimagination of Kukulkan, Khan, right, and this sort of mythos, which is you can see it as as a commercial sort of fabrication of the real, right? But at the same time, you can say like it's a reimagining where they're actually doing materially recreating an idea of this culture, right? Which is not the real thing, but is also not fake either, because they are creating actually something real. They are creating it like a mythos. And trying to reimagine this mythos in the context in which we're living today. And I just like the way your film really played with that idea, especially with the sort of the forger who's, creating a version of the past, which people are then seeing as a representation of the sort of real culture. And then who's to say in the end, like if, what is actually authentic versus what isn't, except for the fact that it's actually invested with meaning, and it has kind of a reference to a group identity that and this, I guess this isn't really a question, is it? But it made me think of of all these things, and this to me sort of the illusion of trying to find like the truly authentic or the truly real in the realm of culture, to me, which always seems like a bit of a kind of a fool's errand in a way.
And, especially since these are cultures that, I won't say they no longer exist. There are still people that are Maya and speak Maya, but are so transformed that, they're not ancient Maya. There are no ancient Maya around anymore. With Lara, I think there are a couple of things. Part of what makes him appealing is that, he's he outsmarted the PhDs and he didn't graduate from high school, right? So there's this kind of revenge. The collectors had been, taking these artifacts out of Mexico and bringing them to New York and Paris and the first world, from the global south to the global north, for centuries, and he kind of gets his revenge by selling them this, fake goods. But I think, the more complicated, or the reason why I'm maybe a little more ambivalent about Lara is, because there are there are at least two ways of approaching these objects, right? One is that, in the art museum, they're beautiful objects, and Lara's pieces are beautiful objects, and the ancient ones, some of them are also very beautiful objects. So they have aesthetic value, all of them, and it doesn't matter if it's a fake from the 20th century or an authentic piece from the 10th century for the aesthetic value. But archaeologists are also interested in these pieces because they give you insight into a cosmovision, right? A worldview that no longer exists, right? And if the, cowrie shelf belt is associated with the wind god, and the, googly round eyes are associated with the rain god, and the snout is associated with some other god, and he's making this kind of cocktail where he takes an element from each god and puts them together on one piece, he's adding bad data to the pool for, you can imagine if you were a graduate student, you wrote your doctoral dissertation about a piece, and it turns out it was a Lara's piece, you kind of wasted your time, right? Because he doesn't have access to that cosmology that these original pieces are reflecting, are expressing in physical form. So it's not a good source of information about an ancient world, but it is a beautiful object. His pieces are beautiful objects in the way that, authentic pieces are. But he no longer shows at the Metropolitan Museum. Now he gets invited to show at like the Veracruz State Fair, which in art world terms is like a demotion of a few rungs.
I have a question about the forgeries, and if the way that people look at them might change their value. For example, there is this very beautiful structure in New Mexico City that has been built for the Olympics in the, I believe, 60s. And it incorporates some of the aspects of the Mesoamerican architecture. And it has much different perception in the eyes of the public, because everyone knows that it's, fake. Maya or other Mesoamerican cultures have not built like this, but it gives the people this sense that what they are making has some sort of connection to the people that lived there before. And if all of those forgeries by Mr. Lara have been instead advertised as not forgeries, but, well, they weren't advertised as forgeries, but if they were advertised as mostly things that are supposed to be inspired by the cultures, if they would have remained at those museums as art objects, and they wouldn't be as much of a source of shame.
Yeah, I don't think they would have stayed in the museum had the museum curator known that they were from the 20th century. Not because of the aesthetic value, but because, it's they're choosing pre-Columbian pieces to be representative. There is, as you describe, especially, there's been a number of efforts by architects, especially, to bring together elements of the pre-Columbian with languages that come from modernism and create different types. I guess the best example of this would be the National Anthropology Museum itself, which has a kind of courtyard structure similar to what they call the nunnery at Uxmal in southern Yucatan in the Puc region, and which has this kind of staircase that's, very kind of long, slow rise in marble that's reminiscent of what you see at a lot of pre-Columbian. It's borrowing all these kind of pre-Columbian elements, like the so-called nunnery at Uxmal. There are these geometric decorations on the second floor, but the lower floor, slightly recessed, is very plain, just with these entrances. So Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, the architect of that museum, was very consciously thinking about how could we take elements of pre-Columbian architecture and make a modernist language from these. And there are other architects that have tried to do things that are similar with, I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright. I live in Los Angeles, and there are 4 or 5 sort of 1920s Frank Lloyd Wright houses that have owe a lot to pre-Columbian sources. Now, Wright, of course, denied it, right? To say that somebody influenced Frank Lloyd Wright would have been, damaging to his ego. So he says, if this thing looks like a pre-Columbian building, that only shows that it's confirmation that, geniuses think alike across the centuries, but not influence. He doesn't like that word. But, I would say it was an influence. So there are a number of architects that, have tried to do a kind of modernism that borrows from or makes reference to the pre-Columbian, and, sometimes very successfully. Those Wright houses in Los Angeles are gorgeous, and other times less so. But everybody, sort of knows. And it's gotta, it's gotta be a pretty, because if you go to a pre-Columbian pyramid, right, it has no function for contemporary, the interior spaces are very small, the hallways are very narrow, everything's very dark, there are no windows. It's good for being a tomb to bury, your king or your emperor, but it's not, if you want to make a house that borrows from the pre-Columbian, it has to have use different kinds of building materials and have interior spaces that have light and air circulation, unless it's a sarcophagus or a giant mausoleum.
Any more questions? Yes, Scott.
Really interesting, thank you. I'd be fascinated to know too what ended on the cutting room floor. Especially of the found footage. I imagine you found some real gems in that stuff that just didn't fit the motif of what you were doing. But I mean, some of that was so character-y, right? Like Morley himself, right? Like,
Yeah.
It was fascinating, and to learn that that's real footage is amazing, right? So I'm interested to know what was on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, there's a lots of home movies and lots of these kind of didactic films and actually a lot of Mexican newsreels. It would be a weekly issue that would have something educational, something comedic, some gossip about a star that got married or went on vacation. They kind of had a formula for those newsreels, but there are a lot of pre-Columbian archaeological episodes. I picked the ones that kind of fit with the other things I was doing, but that's like a gold mine. And I, with a different budget, I could have done like a kind of Ken Burns 9-part series of an hour and a half a night. But I'm not sure. Yeah, that didn't get funded. And then, at a certain point, I finished the film, but I'll confess I keep on buying strange things when they appear on eBay in 16 millimeter. There's a lot of films that just don't have, there's no market for, Pan American Airlines presents Your Vacation in Mexico 1963. Nobody wants that thing, right?
Just for you, right?
It's just for me. And, you end up paying more for the postage than for the reel of film itself. And, there's some treasures hidden in those things so I keep on accumulating stuff, even though I'm not making this film anymore. I haven't for a while. Yeah, finished it some time ago.
Thank you.
It showed at Sundance 2000, so that's like 23 years ago. I'm done with it. Yeah.
Wow. So congratulations again. It's 8 p.m., so I think we should wrap up. Can we thank Jesse? Thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming.
And as I said, we're screening 2 more films by Jesse on Wednesday in the Emigration Museum in Gdynia at 1, and then at 6 p.m. At Dwie Zmiany in Sopot next Friday. Thank you very much.